InvestorIdeas.com podcasts.
Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of InvestorIdeas.com podcasts, looking at cannabis news, stocks to watch, as well as insights from thought leaders and experts. In today's podcast, I interview Keith Merker, the CEO of WeedMD Incorporated, trading on the TSXV Venture as WMD and the OTCQX as WDDMF, where we discuss the company's most recent news developments, as well as both the medical and recreational markets in Canada. Today I'm here talking with Keith Merker, who is the CEO of WeedMD. Keith, it's great to be able to talk to you today. So for any of our listeners who are unfamiliar with WeedMD or yourself, could you maybe just give a brief description of the company as well as your role within?
Absolutely, and thanks for having me today. Pleasure to be here. So WeedMD is a licensed producer of medical and recreational cannabis located in Ontario, Canada. We currently have two operating facilities fully licensed, one of which was our flagship site in a town called Elmer, Ontario, which is located just outside of London. So essentially a couple of hours west of Toronto, for those of you who are unfamiliar. Our second site, which was our expansion location, is in the town of Strathroy, Ontario, which is only about 40 minutes from the first location. Both of these are licensed, and they both serve different purposes for the company, and that's an evolution that's transpired over the course of 2019, in that the Strathroy site is actually a 160-acre farm that we own, and on that site exists 14 acres of greenhouse and another 100 acres of potential outdoor agricultural workable land. And so currently licensed and operating, we have actually 5 acres of greenhouse, and it is state-of-the-art, fully hybridized, fully automated from the standpoint of all the systems on site, and subdivided into, from a flowering perspective, 18 different 10,000 square foot rooms that allow us to have a continuous production cycle running, but yet compartmentalized from the standpoint of different strains going in different rooms, so we can isolate these different potential products from each other and flow it to market over time. Beyond that, we have, as I mentioned, the workable land outside, and 27 acres of that was harvested this year, WeedMD being one of the first and only Canadian licensed producers to produce at scale successfully outdoor grown cannabis. And to me, this was a big disruptor for the company, as well as going forward for the whole industry, because we pulled down successfully north of 20,000 cannabis plants. And some of our flagship strains, like our Ghost Strain Haze or our Pedro's Wine Gums, for instance, these plants were 7 feet wide by 7 feet tall and producing well over a kilogram of bud per plant. And so we had a very successful harvest. We're still getting a lot of the results in. But from a testing perspective, the interim tests that we've done so far indicate that all the product was clean of any potential contaminants, which was, of course, one of the biggest concerns out there with respect to the outdoor grown cannabis. And so we've got a very, very large and successful, and actually from a low cost perspective, market leading production platform in Strathroy. And then the other piece being in Elmer, which originally was an indoor grow and is now actually converted to an extraction and processing hub. So that way we can take all the biomass that we grow in Strathroy, and certainly a large proportion of that gets to market as dried flower, but for the remainder, it can flow to our second site, be processed and extracted into other cannabis products and find its way to market for Cannabis 2.0, which is tremendously exciting for WeedMD.
There's a lot of things you touched on there that I definitely want to talk about. So I'm just going to go away with the last one there, just because it's the last thing you said, which is the extraction component. So focusing on Cannabis 2.0, how much of a percentage of your product are you focusing on sort of the derivative side of the industry, and sort of what elements of the derivative side are you looking at specifically? Are you looking more for topicals or edibles or oils or capsules?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. And if you think about the typical harvest that we have from, again, one of these 10,000 square foot rooms, for instance, we'll pull down, call it 300 kilograms on average of product from each harvest. And some proportion of that will be grade A flower, and some proportion will be extract grade. And, to date, it's been roughly, floats in roughly a 50-50 proportion, if you will. And so that grade A flower we have a home for. We have a great, on the recreational side, we've got a brand called Color, COLOR, which has got rave reviews, and the product itself is we can't keep it on the shelf. So we're super excited about that good old-fashioned dried flower market, number one. But then if you look at the other 50% of that greenhouse production, that will be flowing through our 2.0 facility in Elmer, and we'll be producing all manner of product eventually. My focus right now is on a few specific things, and that's for a number of reasons. Number one is we're a company that's gone through a massive growth phase, and when you do that, you want to try and keep as many variables out of the equations as possible, because you risk sort of spreading yourself too thin and losing focus and failing as a result. And all we have ever tried to achieve with WeedMD, and my strict mandate and motto has always been, let's keep it as simple as possible, because there's enough noise and enough complications and distractions out there to try and lead you off course. In other words, rabbit holes that you want to try to avoid. And so from a production standpoint, even from the dried flower piece, we only came to market with a few select strains and a few select SKUs just to keep simplicity in the overall model. We will take and we are taking the same approach with 2.0. And so we will be, right now, we've got our first extractor up and running. And I should preface that by saying we've been extracting on site since 2017, but we were doing so at a smaller scale. That being said, we do have the experience in-house in producing our own oil and tinctures for the cannabis market here in Canada. And what we've done now is implemented more industrial scale production and processing and extraction. And so we'll be producing, first of all, the ingredients from the standpoint of crude, winterized crude, all the way through to distillate at this point in time. So the easy products for us to get to market right now are, quite frankly, filling vape carts. And that's something we're going to be, we're doing now, and we're going to be present in the market with. And that makes a lot of sense to me and to us as a company. Yeah. Beyond that, we'll get into concentrates. We have some early stage R&D happening on the concentrate side. We view that again as a significant market that maybe has some of the additional regulatory requirements and risks that are involved with producing edibles, for instance, stripped away. So the concentrates market we view as being a little bit simpler and something that we can get to market with a little bit more speed. And then when we think about things beyond that, at the current time, we're looking at a couple of different interesting partnerships. Nothing that I can disclose any further details on at this point, but partnerships that would allow us to get further products to market without having to, again, distract from our core focus of what we're trying to achieve, both in Strathroy and Elmer currently.
That seems like a better strategy than a lot of people in the industry right now. I know a lot of people, it's trying to get into every single vertical you can and have every single type of product offering or SKU that's available out there. And that does seem, as you said, a big distraction in this type of industry right now.
Yeah, if there's one thing I've learned is just keep it simple, keep your focus, and win, and be the best at what you do produce.
Absolutely. So I'd like to touch back as well on your color brand. What are some of the biggest driving factors when it comes to building up a dry flower brand in the Canadian market, and what are you noticing is driving consumers towards this product?
Yeah, another good question. It's a funny one, because there's been a lot of brands that have been produced and brought to market, and by various license holders and even beyond license holders. And it's an interesting space because, as you know, we're very limited in the ways in which we can actually promote our brands, which is issue number one. But number two is that, in my view, some large proportion of the brands that you see in the market today, just quite frankly, aren't going to be around in 12 months' time. And that's whether it's a licensed producer who's no longer around or has been consolidated, whether it's a branding company that has tried to roll out some new brands but has been unable to find consistent, proper supply. I think that will alleviate some of the pressure. I'll call it pressure, but it's actually just sort of distraction of having too many brands on the shelves. I think that the key elements of being successful in this arena are that this vertically integrated model that we have at WeedMD is actually key. There are those who argue otherwise today. I believe that in the nascent stage of this cannabis market, it's very important to control the supply chain. And that is important because we know the quality of product that we're able to grow and process and deliver. And we are able to do so in a consistent fashion time and time again, and not be subject to the whims of and vagaries of the wholesale market, where we may not have a consistency of supply that is critical. Imagine if you opened a can of soup from whatever soup supplier that you liked, and it was different every time you opened that can. You would not buy that soup again. It would be game over for that brand. So for us, it's critical that we control that supply chain in this early stage of the market. We've done a great job of that. We've got not only great cultivation team producing a great product, and I think that the reviews and the fact that we can't keep color on the shelves sort of validates that point. But we've also got some great strains, some unique strains that folks desire, and that's another key component of this, because we're going to get to a place where the market evolves and the consumer gets more sophisticated and is going to be seeking specific things. And we want to have that consumer walk into a store, a retail outlet, and say, hey, where's color? What do you have new from color? Or give me the color wine gums. It's amazing, and I know what I'm going to get.
Could you maybe go into further detail? I know you recently even had sort of a press event out there at the start of October, maybe what the feedback was about the outdoor grow operation from that event, as well as just what are the major benefits or drawbacks to an outdoor grow operation, or what are the struggles you have to go through to get that to where it is producing quality plants right now?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. We picked the one day in October when it was rainy and miserable to hold that event, but nevertheless, everyone walked away with big smiles on their face. And it was funny because I had been, and our team had been so accustomed to what we've done there. Walking through 27 acres of cannabis was an amazing thing, but you took it for granted by the time you got to October, because you do it every day. In fact, I would often, when I was on site, I would put the earbuds in and do my calls just walking through the fields, because it was kind of inspirational as opposed to sitting in an office. But that being said, for the folks who'd never seen it and done it before, it was amazing to see them walk away with big smiles on their faces, having experienced walking through, acre after acre of 7-foot high plants in full bud and flower. So it was cool. It was a great event. We were very happy with the turnout and the feedback that we received. And, at the end of the day, there was a ton of learnings out there. I mean, again, this was the first time anyone's done this at scale, especially in compliance. I shouldn't say that. I should say in compliance with the strict regulations that we have to comply with here in Canada. And so I know there was a handful of us out there with outdoor growth this year. I would, thump my chest a little bit and say that we were very successful in an environment where maybe not everyone was. So the reasons for that were multifold. We, number one, had this previously organic soil to grow in, nice sandy loam soil that was very conducive to growing good cannabis. We had, an acreage that was largely protected by natural forests, so we had a very nice natural buffer around the whole field from the standpoint of, everything from security protection as well as contaminant elimination or avoidance and all those things. It was on the same site as our greenhouse. It lies right next door, same property. So from a logistical standpoint, all of our resources, from a human capital standpoint, from a fertigation standpoint, and everything else, power, all those things that you need, it was already in place. So it allowed us to get to market very quickly and successfully. And I think most importantly, we had the human capital and the genetics to succeed. So we had the folks who've done this before in southwestern Ontario very successfully. We had a chief cannabis officer and a guy named Derek Pedro, who's been doing this for a quarter century very successfully as well. And sort of he headed up that team and was a large reason as to why we were so successful. And not only that, it was the same genetics that these folks had worked with before in this environment. So we knew what was going to succeed out there. And having that in your pocket when you head out, you eliminate risk, or at least you mitigate it. And to me, again, we talked about, our methodologies as a company when we think about how we successfully roll out production and try and keep things simple. And all these things really circle back to one thing, and that's mitigating the risk. there's enough risk out there in the world, let alone in this industry, that you have to always be thinking about how we minimize that and those factors and be successful.
So is the outdoor grow operation more of an extra security, as in you have two sources of sort of production, or is it more so that you're guaranteeing a lower cost production?
It's certainly both. Okay. So having a multifaceted production approach, I think, is important. We've got really, really consistent, high quality product coming from the greenhouse at a very, very low cost of production. And then we've got this outdoor crop, which certainly has a different risk profile attached to it. There's no doubt about that. I mean, Mother Nature could have done various things to us this year. Fortunately, we had a good season. But that's the nature of being an outdoor farmer. And anyone in agriculture is subject to those same, risks. And so on the flip side of that coin, of course, is the fact that this is super low cost production. And so, we'll have an ROI on it just from this year alone that will allow for any future failures, I'll say, but I hate the F word, so I'm not even going to say that. So let's scrub that from the record here, because we're going to be very successful going forward and beyond. And really what we've done this year is set ourselves up for success going forward, because as I mentioned earlier, there was so many learnings from what we did this year that we'll know exactly how to go about this next year and be even more successful.
You mentioned something there that I do find interesting in this space, which is sort of the human component of any company, having the actual experts, having people who have the skills and experience to produce whatever you need in this space. As far as finding these actual human assets for any company, what's the difficulty there? And are you also noticing that there's now sort of a surge of human sort of resources coming towards the cannabis industry? Or is it still difficult to find people with the proper experience and sort of background to actually get what you need accomplished?
Yeah, another good question, and not an easy answer, I don't think, because it kind of ebbs and flows, and you'll see, we'll have times where all of a sudden a number of resumes will cross our desks or a number of introductions, and then maybe sometimes when what you're needing or looking for is just not out there, or you can't seem to find it. So it's one of those things. I guess when it rains, it pours sometimes. But critically, I think from the standpoint of WeedMD as a company, I think we've built a really unique and very open and engaging culture as an organization. And I think that that draws people to us. I think that is a reason for our success. And it's also a product of our success. So it's one of those things where, I've got a lot of staff who think I'm nothing but a tour guide, because, a good portion of my job is actually showing folks through our facilities and our sites, be they investors or partners or what have you. And it's amazing to get the feedback from all the folks that I've taken through, because without a doubt, and with no exceptions, everyone leaves and says, wow, I've been through a number of different facilities, be they production, be they cannabis, be they whatever, and I don't typically see, folks who are greeting and meeting and smiling and engaging from the level of production worker all the way through to executive. And so that is something I've always tried to instill, and I think, again, it's both a product of our success and a reason for our success. And that flows right through the organization. It's something that we take very seriously. We have a culture of respect, and we have a culture of engagement. And I think that, again, back to your question, draws folks to WeedMD.
So very much a much gathers more type of situation.
Sure. Yeah.
That's good to hear, though, that there is that type of culture, because I think that for anyone, whether you're a consumer or an investor or just someone who's following the cannabis industry, that's, I think, ideally what we all want, is that anyone who's working in this industry should be smiling all the time and having, this should be this is a very new and exciting industry to be part of. You want everyone to be excited, but obviously there's some fear for everyone, I think from outside the industry, being the fear of corporatization of, your precious weed is a little bit daunting for some people. And it's good to hear that that's not the case for everywhere.
No, exactly. I mean, look, at the end of the day, we are a corporation. We are structured as a corporation. We're a public company. We trade on the venture exchange under the ticker symbol WMD, and that comes with a lot of things. It comes with a lot of requirements, and it is what it is. But that doesn't mean that you have to be some kind of evil empire.
Exactly.
It doesn't mean that you have to act in a certain way. It certainly gives you an opportunity to build a very large organization. And we're very fortunate to have had that and built on that, but it certainly doesn't mean that you have to act in a certain way. And I think that if there is a mold, we've kind of broken it, and we're very happy about that.
Well, that's good to hear. As you are based in both the medical and recreational space right now, there is sort of the recreational market has impacted the medical market in a lot of different ways. Some of them people have said been negatively. As your company actually works directly with medical patients, supplying them sort of through your WeedMD program, are you noticing that there's an increase of online patient access, or are you noticing that sort of what are the biggest differences you're noticing really between the rec and medical markets, and how has the medical market sort of evolved as recreational has gone online?
Yeah, it's been an interesting, market to watch evolve and participate in, because, ultimately, I think the health cannabis statistics prove it out. There's generally been a flat line as far as patient uptake goes on the medical side since the rollout of rec. And, anecdotally, I can tell you that there's folks that I know who, use cannabis medicinally, but who don't want to jump through the hoops of having to get a medical document and register with a licensed producer, and are just buying now from the OCS or from the recreational market. And quite frankly, in many cases, I don't blame them for it, because the way in which the programs have been designed doesn't provide much of an advantage to the medical market, if any, today. And so, there are exceptions to that from the standpoint of people who, the spectrum of medical user, to be quite frank.
Yeah.
And for those who are on one end of that spectrum and need and lean on the support of a physician through their medical journey, I think that, it's obviously critical that they keep to that path. But when you look at the other end of that spectrum, as I said, a lot of these folks just find it much easier to order their products from the OCS. And that's the unfortunate fact of the matter. We haven't differentiated medical from the standpoint of products to date as an industry. I think we'll see more of that going forward. Even more critically, we haven't differentiated from the standpoint of either coverage or even from the standpoint of pricing and taxation. And that's something I feel very strongly about. WeedMD is part of various lobby groups that are trying to eliminate, for instance, the excise tax, if nothing else, on medicinal cannabis. And why should medical patients be paying a so-called sin tax on their medicine? It makes absolutely no sense. It increases the cost burden on patients, many of whom I can say with assuredness aren't in a position to pay those extra dollars, and it creates a huge barrier to access at the end of the day.
Yeah, you raised a lot of really interesting points there about sort of how the medical industry has played out as recreational has gone on. That was an interesting point as well. Because I know personally a few people fit into that category as well, of why bother going through the medical sort of loop, holes where they can just go to a store and all they have to do is show ID.
Yeah.
And again, the difference of there isn't a differentiation on products so far. Is there any expectation of if that would be coming out at any point, or what the reality of that is at any actual turn?
Oh, definitely. I know of a number of different products that are in the hopper across the industry that are definitely geared more towards the medicinal user and market, outside obviously of just dried flower, which is the traditional consumption format, and hard to believe, but not that long ago, the only methodology that was allowed for production, sale, and consumption. So anyway, the industry's evolving. Certainly, we'd all love it to evolve quicker. But I can tell you that for the most part, folks in this industry are doing their best to keep the ball moving in the right direction as far as all those wonderful things from product development and patient access and ultimately a successful industry.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from a lot of the people I've talked to, that is the general sentiment. I think a lot of the problem with this industry is it's put a lot of us in a weird sort of time frame schedule where we're expecting things to happen at lightning speed, as opposed to the sort of decades of time that bureaucracy has always taken in the past.
Yeah, it's really interesting. This is one of the few cases where you're seeing actually regulations lead the industry. In more established situations, you're typically seeing industry bumping up against the regulations and sort of pushing the envelope from that perspective. In cannabis, it's the regulations which are leading the industry. So everyone's running to catch up with new supply chain pieces and running to catch up to new Cannabis 2.0 product availabilities. And it's kind of fascinating to be a part of, and it's a little bit sort of turned on its head from some similar and or other industries.
Just in final thoughts, then, what can investors sort of look for or expect from WeedMD over the coming months, or what's the big sort of thing investors should be aware of with your company?
Yeah, lots of excitement out there. I should say out there with WeedMD, as we all know, certainly the capital markets are a little bit more difficult right now. But WeedMD is a company that's built to last. It's a company that we've always taken the approach that we avoid the hype and distraction and keep our focus. And I think that as 2019 heads to a close here and we roll into 2020, we're going to see some changes. We're going to see some companies, quite frankly, cease to exist, go away, and you've got to pick your battles and pick your horses as an investor, I think, very carefully now. It's not as if that rising tide or lately that sinking tide is gonna move all of the players in the same direction. We're going to see a lot more differentiation going forward between the haves and the have-nots and the successful companies and the less successful. And I would only point out that we've avoided the hype. We do not put out a press release every other day about some LOI we signed or who knows what. We are a company that's focused on the bottom line, on the top line, on growing a business, and ultimately don't need or want to be thought of as just another cannabis company. We're a player in a new industry, and we're going to put up the numbers to prove out the model that we built. And I think that we would love to have investors come and join us for the ride, because it's going to be a very exciting one.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. That was great advice for investors and a lot of great insight on the market today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Once again, that was Keith Merker, the CEO of WeedMD Incorporated, trading on the TSX Venture as WMD and the OTCQX as WDDMF. To find out more information about WeedMD Incorporated, you can click the link attached in the article or visit their website at weedmd.com. Today's podcast featuring WeedMD is a paid-for distribution. To find out more information, visit our disclaimers and disclosure page on investorideas.com. That's all for today's podcast. Podcast is now a certified word trademark on the blockchain through Cognate Incorporated CM certification. InvestorIdeas.com podcasts are also available on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play Music, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and TuneIn. If you'd like to be a guest or sponsor of this podcast, please contact InvestorIdeas.com. Investor Ideas reminds all listeners to read our disclaimers and disclosures on the InvestorIdeas.com website, and this podcast is not an endorsement to buy products or services or securities. Investors are reminded that all investments involve risk and possible loss of investment. Investor Ideas does not condone the use of cannabis except where permissible by law. Our site does not possess, distribute, or sell cannabis products.